In this video I will be showing you how I created my prosthetic nose from silicone. Before I began, I took the advice from Stephanie Kent that she gave me in a recent interview. She explained to me how important it is to double check that you have everything you need in front of you before you begin making your pieces. This is due to the fact that the silicone begins to cure as soon as it is mixed. Once I was positive that I was ready to start, I sprayed epoxy parfilm over both parts of the mould in a well-ventilated room and began to mix my encapsulator. I mixed with the ratio 1 cap of encapsulator to 5 caps of acetone. It was important to mix the encapsulator to this consistency because if it was mixed too thick, not only would it not flow through the airbrush, but it would make the edges of the piece difficult to blend as they would be too thick. Once I had mixed the encapsulator to a consistency I was happy with, I poured it into the cup of my air gun. As you can see, I then began to spray the encapsulator all over the positive and negative mould. It's important that the encapsulator is sprayed at least 7 inches away from the mould and that it is not sprayed on too thin or too thick, which would either make it difficult to remove from the mould without tearing due to it being extremely delicate, or would make it harder to blend into the skin since the edges would be too thick. It's also important when spraying the encapsulator through the airbrush to do so in a well-ventilated room whilst wearing a mask and goggles, and to make sure that anyone else in the room wears the correct PPE equipment as well. This is because it's really important that nobody inhales the fumes from the acetone because in small quantities it can irritate your nose, throat, lungs and eyes, which can feel very uncomfortable. Moreover, the reason that safety precautions are put in place when using acetone is because if larger quantities are consumed, it can cause headache, dizziness, nausea and vomiting, which would obviously cause serious harm to health and would be a huge health and safety breach. Once the first layer of encapsulator was applied, I used a hairdryer over both parts of the mould on a cool setting to dry it. I then repeated the above steps until I had applied at least 5 layers of encapsulator to my mould. Although you can't see in the video, whilst I was using the hairdryer and airbrush, I took great precautions to ensure that there was no trailing wires around me because it was a trip hazard, which is something I wanted to prevent if possible, as it could cause serious harm to me or someone around me, and would look very unprofessional since it is a hazard that can be prevented. I also made sure that before using my equipment it had been pack tested. This was important because if anything was to go wrong with my electrical appliances, I could prove that I had had them checked over and that they were fit for purpose. This meant that my insurance would cover me for any loss or damage which might have been caused by an electrical fault. Electrical faults are a good example of why artists should adhere to all health and safety practices and legislations, because it is often out of our hands, but if all guidelines have been followed, an artist would still be covered for any loss or damages. Once the encapsulator had dried, I began to mix my silicone. In separate bowls, I weighed out equal parts of component A, B and the softener. It was important to weigh the silicone components out separately because as soon as they are mixed together, they begin to cure. Once all of the components had been weighed out to equal amounts, I began to add my pigment and flock into component A and mixed it all together. I did this because if I made a mistake when mixing the pigment, it meant only one component would be wasted rather than all of them, which would save me time and money. was happy that the pigment was properly mixed, I added the 2 other components and thoroughly mixed them all together. As soon as they were completely mixed, I poured them into the negative cast from a height to reduce the amount of air bubbles that were left in my piece. After I had poured all of the silicone into the mould, I pressed the other half of the mould in place, making sure that I aligned the keys. I then secured with a G-clamp to apply pressure. This was to ensure that a fine cutting edge was created. Once the clamp was secure, I left it for 40 minutes to set.